The next speaker is Julia Annas, who we talk about his Stoic virtue in offputting as it seems. Just to give you a brief, as you notice, I'm not introducing the speakers because you have the bios, you can look them up, and nobody wants to listen to me talk about nothing for too long. And besides, we have a very tight schedule. But I will tell you something about Julia. Last night we had a reception for the speakers at my apartment, and somebody said, "Oh my God, being here with you is like being at a party with the Rolling Stones." That's how important and influential she is in the field. Please, Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia Annas, I was just introduced, and I'm a philosopher, and that's it. That seems kind of disappointing after Donald's interesting description of all the various things he's done and all the various skills he brings to it. My title is Stoic Virtue as Off-Putting as It Seems? And that may seem a bit odd after the last talk because, you know, Stoicism isn't at all off-putting if you come to it through thinking about mindfulness and the sorts of things that Donald was talking about so well. And many people have come to Stoicism through the way Stoic ideas get you through really tough times. For example, Admiral Stockdale's description of how, with the help of Epictetus, he got through actual torture and imprisonment and so on. So there are many ways in which Stoicism can seem an obvious way to go. But, as I say, I'm a philosopher, and eventually you get to Stoicism as a philosophy, mostly set up by the early Stoics, that the later Roman Stoics, the people that we mainly read, they had learnt that, and that's the background to the way they write about the topics they write about. And also, you may want to come to Stoicism through virtue itself, because in the ancient world, and I think to many people in the modern world, the entry point for ethical reflection is thinking about your own life as a whole and how well or badly it's been going. And very often we turn to Stoicism or some other philosophy because basically the thought is, how is my life going? I want to be a better person. So eventually we get to look at Stoic philosophy on virtue and happiness. And sometimes for people, many people, this can bring us to a screeching halt because the way the Stoics write about these things is very off-putting. And this isn't just a problem for us. It was notorious in the ancient world that the way the Stoics taught about virtue and happiness was very off-putting. And there's a question, why is it off-putting? Why did they do it why did they put their ideas in this particular way? Now, for the Stoics, notoriously, virtue is not just necessary for happiness, but it's sufficient. And of course, that's enough to show that by virtue and happiness, they don't mean the ideas that immediately come to mind for us. By happiness, they don't mean feeling good or having a positive outlook on the world. They mean eudaimonia, that is, a flourishing life. I haven't enough time to go on more about that and fill that out more. But they mean a flourishing life, not just feeling good. And they say for that you need to be virtuous. That's not news in the ancient world, but the Stoics say it's sufficient. If you're virtuous, that's all you need to have a flourishing life. Now, given that, you'd think, well, they would do their best to make us want to be virtuous, to introduce us to go through the gate of learning about virtue to become happy. But we find, and people in the ancient world found this, so this is not just a modern gloss on it, we find a lot of very strange things that they say about virtue. I won't be covering all of them, but the two most notorious ones. First of all, they say there are no degrees of virtue. Either you're virtuous or you're vicious. Either you're a good person or you're a bad person. And then they couple that by saying, and actually there aren't any good people. The only virtuous person is the completely virtuous person, the so-called sage. I'll say more about this word sage in a minute. But given that the only virtuous person is the completely virtuous person, the sage, we're all bad, we're all vicious. Because the sage is as rare as the phoenix, and the phoenix is a mythical bird. Every 10,000 years, the phoenix immolates itself in flames and is reborn. So don't waste your time wondering whether there are any good people around here. So, right. So we're stuck with that conclusion. And obviously, this is a very counterintuitive conclusion. Why did they say that? Now, the Stoics aren't elitist about virtue. They think everybody has the capacity to be virtuous. Everybody, emperors, slaves, and so on. That's very fundamental to them. And that makes it even odder that they should say these things about virtue, because it looks as though you need to get a bit further into the philosophy to have some philosophical training before you can make sense of them. And it seems as though they're waiting for us to come to them and put our minds to figuring out what they could possibly mean by that. And that's at variance with what some other philosophical schools did. For example, the Epicureans were quite keen on making what we would call PR, about becoming Epicureans. One Epicurean, later in the ancient world, spent a seriously large amount of money putting up a big stone inscription, rather like a huge billboard in his hometown, telling everybody how miserable they were and how they should be Epicureans. Whereas the Stoics seem to make a big thing about saying there are no degrees of virtue. And that means, quite seriously, suppose you want to turn your life around. You rethink your life. You think, okay, I'll give, my career and money making less stress. I'll give more time and more energy to doing what I should be doing, mindfulness, living a good life, and so on. At the end of all that, you're no more generous than you were before. You're just vicious. You haven't become more virtuous. And that means you haven't become more generous, you haven't become braver, and all the rest of it. Only when you become completely generous, brave, tactful, and all the rest of it will you be virtuous. And by the way, that's not going to happen. And the flip side isn't any better. In fact, it's worse. We might say, okay, maybe we're not completely virtuous, but surely there must be degrees of vice. I may be pretty bad, but I'm not Hitler or Stalin. But there are no degrees of vice either. You're good or you're bad, and there's no degrees of being bad. Now, it seems that nothing could be more off-putting if you're a beginner. It doesn't matter how hard you try, it doesn't matter how intelligently you try, you'll still be no braver, more tactful, or whatever. You won't have acquired any more virtue, and you won't have become any less vicious. Now, and there are various metaphors they use for this. If you're a foot under the water, you're just as drowned as if you're on the seabed, and so on. And that's not just off-putting. It makes it sound as though positively there's no point in trying. Why try? Why bother? Now, it's puzzling that they do this, and it's not just one or two texts. This is a very central thesis in Stoic ethics. Why do they do this? Well, one thought is, if you think about it, you can see they're making a point about virtue. They don't have to take it in a way that makes everything they say about virtue sound completely ridiculous. The idea that there aren't any degrees of virtue doesn't mean that there are no degrees of progress towards virtue. And in fact, the Stoics say, yes, there is progress towards virtue. They have an actual word for the person who is progressing, the progressor. That's the person who is trying to become virtuous. And you can do that. So you reorder your priorities, you try to live up to your new commitment, and you're progressing towards virtue. And there are degrees of that. You can have progressed a little or a lot. So the metaphor of drowning when you're a foot under the surface means you haven't achieved virtue. It doesn't apply to your progress towards virtue. So we can still make distinctions among people who are progressing. So we don't have to say, there's no point trying because I'm not going to become virtuous any more at the end than at the beginning, because I can have progressed more or less. And we do this sort of thing all the time. Usually we compare our own progress with that of people that are doing better. We compare our progress unfavorably to ourselves. We say, somebody we know is better than I am because they're braver or they're more generous or something like that. And in those ways, we can compare our progress towards virtue. Now, of course, we also compare ourselves favorably with other people. We say, I'm more generous than that person, but that's not relevant to ethical progress. That's likely to lead to ethical regress, if anything, I think. So the Stoics are quite aware of this, and by having this figure of the progressor, they encourage us to do it. But that just pushes the problem a bit. Okay, they say these very off-putting, unintuitive things, and then there's the bit when they sort of take it back. You can't progress in virtue, but you can progress towards virtue. It makes it sound, and this is another objection that was brought by hostile critics in the ancient world, it makes it sound as though they're making a verbal point. And again, what is the point of insisting on this? Well, I think there is a point. They're insisting that virtue is an ideal. Now, okay, everybody insists that virtue is an ideal. Nobody who has a theory of virtue says, look around, everybody here is virtuous. Most people are virtuous. Virtue is something we have to aspire to. We all recognize that we aren't particularly near becoming virtuous. We have to aspire to become brave. We should all be braver than we are. We should all be more generous than we are, and so on. So it's not news that virtue is something we aspire to. But the Stoics want to emphasize that. It's because they think we should bear in mind that virtue is an ideal that we're all aspiring towards. It's not something that we've made progress in. Becoming virtuous for a Stoic is lifelong. It's lifelong learning. And they tend to think we're always tempted to give up. For a Stoic, there's never going to be a point when we can say, well, that was hard work, but I'm there. Finally, I've achieved it. Finally, I'm brave, or I'm as brave as I can be, so there's no point trying, I've done my best, I'm there. No, right up until the day we die, we should always be aspiring to be better than we are. Now, we may not like this thought. We especially don't like it at 9:45 on a Saturday morning. We like to think there's something we can achieve, some place we can get to where we've finally got there. But for the Stoics, being a Stoic is a continuing way of life. It's something you carry with you wherever you go. It's not a teach yourself program. You can teach yourself a language, and then there comes a point, hopefully, where you've done it. You now can speak Italian, for example. And you continue, and you're fortified by what you've taught yourself. So you've been changed by what you've taught yourself, you go on your way fortified by what you've taught yourself. And the Stoics think, we like to think of Stoicism or ethics generally that way. You teach yourself ethics. So you teach yourself ethics and you do it earnestly and you learn what ethics is about and you try to become an ethical person. And there comes a point when you've done it and you can go on your way fortified by what you've learned. And notoriously, the Stoics say, no, it's never like that. It's always an ideal that you should aspire to. And they think it worthwhile but to make these, on the face of it, very off-putting points to make you bear that in mind. There's another off-putting claim, the second one that I shall consider. As I say, we're all vicious. The only person who is virtuous is the sage. Now, what's the sage? Well, for the Stoics, the virtuous person is the wise person, and so the word for it is just the wise person. And in older translations, that was translated the sage. Now, the trouble with the sage is it has some unsuitable associations. It sounds faintly comic. So more recently, translators started writing the wise man. But then, of course, we started noticing that doesn't sound right. So people tended to substitute the wise person, but that's a bit clumsy. So on the whole, translators have reverted to the sage because it's gender neutral and it's not so clumsy. So the sage is just the completely virtuous person, the person who's as rare as the phoenix. Now, the sage is the completely virtuous person, and in many theories, the virtuous person is the person you aspire to. So Aristotle thinks you acquire virtue by becoming habituated to act in certain ways, and there's an ideal you can have. He uses a different word for it, but it's the virtuous person. You try to act as the virtuous person would act. Now, you can't do that with the figure of the Stoic sage, because they say a number of very striking and off-putting things about the sage. And they say it at length. It's something you can't avoid. When you read Stoic ethics, you find there's always a section about the sage. And at first you think, what is going on here? The sage is the only king, the only general, the only doctor. And they find the sage is the only person who's free. The sage is the only person who's handsome. Even if he's ugly, he's the only person who's tall, even if he's short. It's very hard at first sight to make sense of all this. And it looms quite large in Stoic ethics. And on the whole, we tend to ignore it because we don't have any convenient place to put it in our view of how you learn an ethical theory. Sometimes it looks as though the sage is the person that we get to be more like, though we don't get to be the sage, by being more reflective about what we do. So they sometimes say, the sage is the person who knows better than the king what a king should do, knows better than a general what a general should do. So that most generals might just go ahead, but the virtuous person would make sure that they knew all the relevant things that a general needs and also would do all these things virtuously. And they looking at it that way, they sometimes turn into what look like intellectual skills, things that Plato and Aristotle wouldn't dream of considering that way. Plato and Aristotle consider money-making, for example. That's not something the virtuous person would think about qua virtuous person. It's just a sub-theoretical knack. But the Stoics say it's a state both theoretical and practical concerning what's advantageous for the household. The virtuous person is the person who would make money in a virtuous kind of way, and so there's nothing that the sage wouldn't be good at. Now, one off-putting thing about the sage, and again, the ancients tended to make fun of this a lot, is if the sage is the only king and the only general and the only doctor and the only moneymaker, it looks as though the sage will have to have an awful lot of empirical knowledge. He'll have to have the knowledge that a general has, the knowledge that a doctor would have, and so on. But whose idea of becoming virtuous is it that you have to acquire all this other knowledge? Now, again, this is an off-putting way of putting something, which we can see makes a lot more sense when we look at the broader strokes of how Stoic ethics works. The basic idea, I think, is to become virtuous, you have to acquire the knowledge that the virtuous person has. And formally, that's the same for everybody. Everybody can get it. Everybody, slave, emperor, and so on, is capable of acquiring the understanding that the virtuous person has. And that would be the understanding of how to do the right thing on every occasion. You would have all the virtues, and so you would know how to act generously, bravely, and all the rest of it. And that is the same in everybody. But there's also a sense in which it's different for everybody, because people live in different countries, they have different languages and cultures, and they have different roles. Some of us are generals, some of us are doctors, and so on. And also, they're aware, each of us has our own particular personality basis. Cicero talks a lot about that in the first book of his work on duties. So each of us, to the extent that we can progress towards virtue, we're all progressing towards the same understanding, but also it's an understanding that will be different for you and different for me. And so there is no one ethical ideal that we can all progress towards. We all progress towards being a sage in the situation in which we are. And so the idea is, the sage is the only king. Well, I'm not a king, that's no help to me. I'm a doctor. But the sage is the only doctor, meaning the only way to be virtuous as a doctor, the only way to be a doctor properly is to be virtuous as a doctor. I should be virtuous as a doctor, somebody else should be virtuous as a general, and so on. So these odd comments about the sage fit into the idea that we are doing something when we become virtuous which is both universal and particular. There is no one ethical ideal that we should all be aiming towards. We should all be aiming towards something more abstract, the understanding that the virtuous person has, but that will be embodied differently in each of us. Now, I think most ethical theories have an ideal virtuous person. Now, the Stoics' virtuous person is a more demanding ideal than that of Aristotle or even Plato, actually. And it's also more subtle. There isn't a single ideal that we should all be aiming towards. We should be aiming towards, as I said, something more abstract, achieving complete ethical understanding, and we should all be doing it from here, from the place that I, you, and so on are. Now, there's still a question whether the Stoics could have done a better job getting these ideas across than they do. And one might think the Stoics should have had better PR about their theory, their ethical theory. But as we know, the Stoics are not interested in PR. They're interested in somebody who seriously wants to become a Stoic. And they say, well, it's lifelong, it's demanding, and you have to try and acquire the whole of ethical understanding from where you are. It's not easy. And they don't pretend it's easy. They, as it were, set up these barriers, or at least don't try to attract people at the start. You have to use your own mind to figure out what these off-putting theses mean. Now, as I say, perhaps we don't want to be told that it's hard, we don't want to be told that it's lifelong, but there they are. And if you come to Stoicism through mindfulness or through reading Epictetus on how to cope with dangers, there's nothing wrong with being put off by what they say about virtue and happiness. Maybe you don't think about ethics in terms of virtue and happiness. But I think the Stoic view on virtue and happiness is a very interesting and deep one. And it's worth getting over the off-putting statements to get to the heart of it. Thank you.
Are there any questions, comments? Yes.
Can you pick somebody up with a piece?
Right there. Right there. Yes. Yeah.
I was interested in what you're saying about the virtue being different perhaps for different people. And I don't remember where I read this about the definition of virtue. The original meaning of the word had to do with the suitability of an object for its purpose. And I was wondering if that applied to people would suggest a more of an internal definition of what virtue is for each person, as what, I was wondering how that relates to the definition of virtue for Stoicism.
Right, yes, the original meaning, arete, is what you're good at, agathos. And so there is a sense in which, there's a virtue of a horse and a virtue of a house and so on. Now, actually, by the time the Stoics are writing, this is regarded as a different sense, actually. Cicero comments on this. So it doesn't just immediately go over that the virtue of a human being will be being good as a human being. But you can see that for the Stoics, formally, virtue is being good as a human being. Now, what is that? Well, it's being good as a rational being. But then it turns out they have this very rich notion of rationality that unfolds and is the basis of how you learn to be virtuous. But I think they think that's, as it were, the formal sense in which that's what we all should try to do. But they take account of the fact that if everybody is going to be virtuous, they're all going to be virtuous, they'll have to apply the rational understanding to what they've got, the virtue, the material of virtue, as they say, where they are.
I wonder if you can comment on modern consumer culture and whether virtue is less prominent today than it was in other periods, and how can that be changed?
Well, virtue used to be sort of non-existent in ethical philosophy even about 40 years ago. I mean, when I was a graduate student, nobody talked about it. And now virtue ethics is very big in ethical philosophy and also in lots of areas of applied ethics. I mean, there's virtue, more work on virtue in the law, in business ethics, and so on. Now, in, as it were, the wider culture, I noticed that virtue is more acceptable as a term. If you look at self-help books in bookstores, the word virtue comes up all the time. I don't think this means people have fortunately acquired a deep and resonant idea of what virtue is, but I think people are beginning to see ethics more in terms of virtue than they did. I mean, that's a little weak as an answer to what you say, but certainly I think as a way of getting people to appreciate what consumer culture is and the sorts of things it does to society, it's a much better start than talking about Kantian principles or something like that. So I'm cautiously optimistic about it.
Back there, if we can get to it, yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious if the difficulty of approaching being saved or pure and virtuous aligns with Zeno's paradox. I mean, it's coming from the same source.
I don't think so. They don't present it as a paradox of Zeno's sort, namely, but it's a paradox in the sense of something violently not just counterintuitive, but violently counterintuitive. And in that sense, they talk about the Stoic Paradoxes. And right, I mean, that's what they were called. There are the Stoic Paradoxes, only the wise person is virtuous and so on. And some people do find them a difficulty.
I'm finding a third, and there's one with water over there. What do you think does it make if I get? Maybe I'm not 20 If I'm trying a third, and there's a bottle of water over there, what difference does it make if I get 10 yards or 20 yards closer to that bottle of water? If I'm never going to achieve that? Oh.
Well, that's one way of, that's the off-puttingness, right? If you're dying of thirst, does it do you any good to get near the water? Well, you got nearer to it. I mean, you know. Yeah. But the Stoics don't tend to think you're starting from dying of thirst. They think of it more positively. Virtue is what you aspire to. So Stoicism is many-sided. It's a holistic system. If you think you're dying of thirst, that would be the position of somebody like Admiral Stockdale, you know, being tortured. And then you don't think about virtue and never getting there. You think about the sorts of things Epictetus said about coping with what you've got now. What they say about virtue and happiness is meant to give you the right idea about what it is to live a better life. Now, if you're being tortured in prison, you're not really thinking about how can I live a better life. You're thinking about how can I get through this. And both of those are sides of Stoic ethics, right?
Yeah, off the top of your head, Susan Wolf saying more things.
Yeah.
So,
excuse me, can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Repeat the
This
question.
is about Susan Wolf's moral saints.
so for Stoicism as a practical philosophy, how does that fall into the argument against moral saints?
Yeah, about Stoicism as a philosophy, isn't it an objection that it would leave you with something like Susan Wolf's moral saints? Well, I think not, and that's because, and I have to say this very quickly, because Susan Wolf sees it in terms of those, your concerns, there's morality, and then there's meaning in life, and she thinks that living in a moral way would take away from you a lot of things that give meaning to your life. And Stoicism, because it's a virtue ethics, and you have to take it on trust, and I can explain at greater length, because it's a virtue ethics, doesn't think that living virtuously, it would lead you to become the sort of person that Susan Wolf thinks is a moral saint.
Thank you.